Chapter 26 looks at the 1960s, in particular at John F. Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson's presidencies. And as you may have already figured out, one of the big themes is the different topics that were controversial and helped to form the modern day political parties. Because maybe not exactly, but very, very similar issues in the 1960s are eerily similar to the present issues that we have in 2021, in particular, dividing between the political left and the political right. The 1960s starts with Dwight D. Eisenhower leaving office and giving a speech in which he complains about something called the military-industrial complex. We can compare this to George Washington's farewell address. In both cases, you have a well-respected political and military leader leaving office, and in both cases, they're giving advice. In the case of George Washington, his suggestion is that America should be isolationist. In the case of Eisenhower, his argument is that America needs to watch out to make sure that a combination of the military and industry, i.e. factories and production, those two working together don't become too powerful in the United States.
I come to you with a message of leave-taking and farewell.
This speech did not get very much attention. When a new president is coming to power, as John Kennedy was, the spotlight was not on Dwight Eisenhower.
We have been compelled to create a permanent armaments industry of vast proportions.
There was a feeling at the time that this must have been written by some speechwriter who just sneaked into the speech.
In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex.
3 months ago,
I'm going to stop there because most of the rest of the video is just talking about the process of writing the speech. But the key idea is that Eisenhower, as president, at this point is more of a political leader than a military leader. And his concern is that all parts of America as a country, its government, its economy, and its society had become overly reliant upon the arms race, the buildup as a result of competition with the Soviet Union, and that it was unhealthy because politically we would be overly reliant on war as opposed to diplomacy. Economically, because too much of our production and our output and our jobs were tied to the defense industry, and that socially it was leading America towards a more sort of a path of that emphasized the military and war over other things. So while it is true that he was the supreme commander of the European theater in World War II, it is in part because of that experience that he, in effect, criticized the military having too large of an influence, not because the military was secretly plotting to take over the country, but simply because in the middle of the Cold War, it was too easy and too convenient to throw money at the military as a way to solve all of America's problems. As a modern day interpretation of that, this chart over here indicates the 2020 budget for the United States, a total of $1.3 trillion, at least the discretionary budget. And you'll note that the Defense Department has $718 billion, or 57% of the discretionary budget for the United States. And if you add in Veterans Affairs, which is another 7%, nearly 2/3 of the United States budget went towards either active military or, in the case of veterans, no longer active duty military. And in contrast, those two portions were 2/3, and 1/3 was Health and Human Services, Education, Homeland Security, Housing and Urban Development, State and International, Energy, Justice, Transportation, Agriculture, Treasury, Interior, Commerce, and Labor. So the idea that the military, as well as all the accompanying private industries that have contracts with the defense industry, have an outsized influence, as demonstrated by this budget, goes to show sort of the modern day consequences of the ideas that Eisenhower was talking about. Some of you may be thinking, well, that's Trump. He is fully supportive of the military. It's one of the things he's very proud of and bragged about constantly. And so if we look 4 years earlier to the 2016 budget, this is the last budget from Obama's presidency. It's 1.15 trillion. So it's 0.15 trillion smaller. The defense budget, instead of being 718 billion and 57%, is instead 625 billion and 54%. So it is smaller. That is objectively, mathematically true, but not relative to everything else, right? So the idea that Eisenhower warned against is less of a political issue dividing Democrats and Republicans. Both political parties have encouraged defense spending and military investment and overseas wars. But outside of this, most of the issues in the 1960s relatively neatly fit into left and right, Democrat and Republican. So one of the takeaways is that if we look at the modern day budgets now, and presumably when we look at Biden's budget, we're probably not going to see significant changes. We're going to see very similar things to what Eisenhower warned against, of the military industrial complex having an outsized influence, more so than Eisenhower would have wanted. The early 1960s saw the publication of a book called Silent Spring, written by an author named Rachel Carson. And in the book, she criticized, in particular, pesticides as having a detrimental effect on wildlife. And so the idea of the title Silent Spring, the idea being that normally during spring you hear birds and other wildlife, but with unconstrained pesticide usage, our springs would be silent as a result of all the animals that would be wiped out. And so we had seen some elements of something resembling an environmental movement, maybe with the transcendentalists, maybe with the progressive movement, but the modern day environmental movement, and in particular, the division between environmental protection on one side and private interests on the other side, is very similar to the ones that we see nowadays. And so in the modern day interpretation, you can look at things like, say, for example, climate change and the question of like, hey, should the government regulate climate emissions? Or in the case of the aftermath of Silent Spring, the question of whether pesticide industries should be regulated by the government, or if they should have a laissez-faire economy where private industry maybe regulates itself, maybe consumers with a free market decide what they want to invest in, what they want to buy or not. And so the modern day environmental movement is not single-handedly the legacy of Rachel Carson, but is at least on some level sort of the legacy of her writings. Similarly, the modern day women's rights movement has some inspiration from a book called The Feminine Mystique, written by Betty Friedan. You'll recall that there were lots of other earlier women's rights movements dating back to Seneca Falls Convention and arguably even earlier. But after the progressive era and the push to get women the right to vote in the 19th Amendment, there was not really an organized women's movement. And this book was one of the factors that contributed to the 1960s and 70s having a much more organized, active women's rights movement that in various forms continues up until today. In particular, the Feminine Mystique talked about the sort of existence and the roles that were allowed for suburban housewives. Betty Friedan was a suburban housewife and had graduated from a top college, was very well educated, and she wrote in the book about why it was that she and a whole bunch of other women, they had nice homes and they had nice cars and they were raising children and they loved their families. But at the same time, they wanted to do other things, different things, more things. And the idea that society had very tight constraints on what was acceptable and allowable for women to do, that contradiction between what they could do and what society told them they should do was a source of anxiety and depression for millions of women nationwide. And so when she published her book, a whole bunch of women read it and were like, holy crap, I thought I was the only one. And it turns out they were not. And so that contributes to organizations, for example, like the National Organization of Women, as well as many others that have a more consistent, organized sort of agenda advancing women's rights. So one comparison that I want to make explicitly is that if you look at the modern day environmentalist movement inspired by Silent Spring and others, in the 1960s, it was less so, but nowadays the two parties have more clearly defined themselves around these issues. So generally speaking, the Democratic Party is more in favor of government regulation to protect the environment, and the Republican Party is generally speaking more in favor of allowing companies to self-regulate or to have the free market solve a problem, but that the government shouldn't be involved with environmental protection. Generally speaking, the Democratic Party is more in favor of non-traditional roles for women. Generally speaking, the Republican Party is more in favor of traditional roles for women. This photo is of a guy named Mario Savio, who is a student at UC Berkeley, and there were a wide variety of protests at Berkeley, including anti-war protests, environmental protests, women's rights protests, race protests of all various types, and the UC Berkeley campus cracked down on student free speech efforts. And so the sign that his head is partially blocking reads, "This campus is on strike for free speech." So the free speech movement in some ways was the movement and the organization that sort of enabled all of the other protest movements to happen, because if they're not allowed to gather peaceably and assemble and petition for a redress of grievances, that's the exact phrasing from the First Amendment, then all of a sudden the other movements become more restricted and more limited. And so the modern day comparison, if you look, for example, at all of the conversations that have been made around maybe it's Black Lives Matters protests, maybe it's protests around climate change, maybe it's women's marches, generally speaking, all of those movements and all those demonstrations are by people on the political left, generally speaking, aligned with the Democratic Party. And you'll see politicians who say things like, well, they shouldn't be allowed to protest and there has to be some kind of restriction. These protests turn violent, so they shouldn't be allowed. They should only be in certain areas. Why are these people complaining? And those attitudes are most commonly expressed by the Republican Party. So the idea is not that exclusively 100% one party is in favor of free speech versus the other. But if you look at the types of criticisms, the types of policies that have been passed that are either making it easier to have public protests or more difficult to have public protests, generally speaking, it fits along the Democrat-Republican divide. And so one thing to note is that in all of these examples, yes, the 1960s were, 50 or 60 years ago, but note that if you were 18 years old in 1968, that means that you're 71 years old now, right? There's a bunch of people, it's the exact same individuals who are alive right now, who their formative years were during this time. And that's part of the reason why the issues and the conflicts and the disagreements in the 60s feel so similar to nowadays, is because in a lot of cases, the exact same people, or if not their children. And so we're starting to see history that resembles the present much more. One of the long list of issues that similarly fits into the broadly Democrat-Republican divide in the United States has to do with school prayer. In the state of New York, as with many states in the decades leading up to the 1960s, students were required by law to say prayer. In the case of New York, the prayer was not attached to any one specific religion, which according to the government meant that it was totally okay and students could be forced to say it. But according to some of the students and their families, some of them were non-religious, some of them were atheists, some of them were Unitarians. But in any case, they protested against this requirement, and the Supreme Court found that schools nationwide could not force students to say a prayer. Note that if you as an individual wants to pray while you're at school, you are 100% protected and allowed to. In fact, if you want to get together with some of your friends and pray at school, you're 100% allowed to and protected. The distinction here is that prior to Engel versus Vitale, the school could punish students if they chose not to pray, either because of their religious beliefs or any other factor. And so if we look at the modern day, generally speaking, the Republican Party believes that religion should play a more active role, not only in schools, but in government and in society. And so there's been fights over whether court buildings should have copies of the Ten Commandments in them, in addition to the Bill of Rights. There's been disagreements over whether the school districts should be required to fund through vouchers private schools that are specifically religious private schools. And generally speaking, the Republican Party is more in favor of religion having a role in public schools, and generally speaking, the Democratic Party is not. But those same issues that are going on now didn't originate with Engel versus Vitale, but at least can be traced back to that as part of its origin. The 1960s also sees the creation of the Berlin Wall. You may recall that the East Germans had set up a blockade, and that blockade was a temporary measure that was sort of resolved through the airlift. As a more permanent solution, East Germans built a wall around West Berlin, specifically because a bunch of East Germans had been going to West Berlin and then from West Berlin to West Germany and from there to freedom and the rest of the world. In order to prevent that from happening, the East Germans built this wall, and this photograph is of one stretch of it. And you'll notice that one side of the wall is very colorfully and brightly decorated with murals, and the other side of the wall is untouched. It looks like they just built it because no one is allowed to paint on it or get anywhere close to it. And so the colorful side of the map, you see this is West Berlin. This guy over here is walking his dog. There's no armed guards anywhere. He's just like, chillaxing. And that represents, in effect, the freedom and the lack of restrictions on people in the West. On the other side, you'll notice that there's a whole bunch of some military guys over here, and there's armed guys over here. And the reason why this wall is untouched is not because nobody in East Germany likes art. It's because this was heavily patrolled, and any person who was going too close to the wall without permission would get arrested and or killed. So the idea that the wall, technically, sure, walls keep people out of both sides, but this wall was specifically designed in order to prevent people from leaving the East. If the wall did not exist, large numbers of people would have fled the country. And so there's that division between the west side of the wall that has free expression and freedom of movement and freedom of travel. And then there's the east side of the wall, which does not have any of those freedoms. And the Berlin Wall remains in place for nearly 30 years until the late 1980s, when it eventually falls as the Soviet Union falls. And it served, and parts of it are still visible now as like historical monuments, as a reminder of the division, both physically and metaphorically, between East and West Germany. The 1960 election is remarkable for a lot of reasons, not the least of which is that John F. Kennedy beats Richard Nixon in part because of the influence of television. You may recall that television had been around throughout the 1950s, but it didn't necessarily play a large role in the elections that were in that decade. It definitely played a role in the 1960 election. Someone says that their grandpa lived in East Germany in the 1970s. That's amazing. If it is possible to find out as much as you can, that would be terrific. In part because, you definitely should ask him. Not only because it's super interesting, right? And like, what exactly was his life like living there? But then also it has the added benefit of, finding out a personal connection to it, right? Because like, sure, you could Google and find out what life was like in East Germany, but that's a very different thing than like you personally finding out what your grandfather's experience was. People who listened to the debate on radio concluded that Richard Nixon had won. People who watched the debate on television concluded that John F. Kennedy won. And so that distinction, which is attributed maybe to John F. Kennedy's attractiveness, maybe it's attributed to him putting on makeup, which Richard Nixon refused to do. Maybe it had to do with sort of a more charismatic speaking. But whatever the case, the 1960 election is used as a demonstration that television is a transformational media that, because the election was so close, potentially changed the outcome of the election. And so now if you look in the modern day, social media, whether it's Twitter or it's Facebook or TikTok or whatever else, the internet has fundamentally changed the way that we communicate and has an outsized influence on our political decisions, in much the same way that television did in the 1970s. All right, so Tate says that his dad's best friend's dad had a racehorse ranch that was split down the middle because of the wall. Holy crap. I imagine that it was very, very well guarded, because anything that's like in the middle of the wall, the East Germans would be highly, highly suspicious of. So that would be worth a deep dive down the rabbit hole to find out more about that, because that sounds like an unusual and exceptional situation. John F. Kennedy wins the election and ultimately only serves president for 2.5, 3 years before he's assassinated. But during that time, he has a series of major, major embarrassments and some successes. But the primary embarrassment, at least the first one, was the Bay of Pigs invasion. In 1959, Cuba becomes communist, and Cuba is extraordinarily close to the United States. It had previously been ruled by a pro-US dictator named Batista, and when he gets removed from power, a lot of Cubans flee to the United States, and the United States welcomes them with open arms in spite of any immigration restriction because they don't like communism, and neither do we, so the United States welcomes them in. This operation was planned prior to Kennedy's administration, but it was executed under him. And the plan was to have a small number of pro-democracy, pro-capitalism Cubans with US support infiltrate Cuba, organize a resistance, and overthrow Castro's regime. The United States, as well as the Cubans who had fled to the United States, believed this would work because we assumed that Castro was unpopular and that all people were waiting for was the slightest window of opportunity, and they would all join the party to overthrow Castro. And it turns out that was a horrible misestimation. There is not widespread support for an anti-Castro revolution. And this photograph over here shows a bunch of Cubans who had been backed by the United States being arrested. This photograph appeared on newspapers all over the world and was a demonstration not only of America's failure, but a very, very, very public failure. Right? Castro makes sure to go on any news agency that'll have him and tell them all about how America failed to overthrow his government and how afraid they were of him and his supporters. And so this was as huge a public failure as the United States has ever had. In part in response to the Bay of Pigs invasion, Cuba decides that they have to defend themselves. Right? Cuba is a tiny country. There's no way it can defend itself against a US invasion. But what they can do is they can host Russian missiles. So Cuba, in order to prevent any future American invasions, allows Russia to install missiles that potentially, as indicated by this map, could reach not only Miami, which is 234 miles away, but could reach the West Coast, could blanket the entire United States with missiles that, because they're traveling a short distance, are more reliable, more accurate than if they were being launched from someplace else. And so the Cuban Missile Crisis is arguably one of the closest times the United States has ever come to mutually assured destruction. There were very, very tense days when it was possible the United States would try to nuke Cuba before the missiles were fully installed, knowing that the Russians would retaliate. And thankfully, calmer heads prevailed and neither side launched nuclear weapons. In exchange for Russia withdrawing missiles from Cuba, the United States agrees to not invade Cuba. And equally importantly, which a lot of Americans forget about, the United States also agrees to withdraw missiles that we had in Turkey. Most of Russia's population is in the west of the country, much more so than the east. And we had missiles that could reach 1,490 miles, which includes Moscow, the capital, as well as the major urban centers of Leningrad and Kiev in particular. So if the Russians had not installed missiles in Cuba, the United States would have kept the missiles in Turkey. And so this is an example of how incredibly tense and frustrating and near the world came to nuclear annihilation simply because the United States wanted to have missiles in Turkey and possibly invade Cuba. And as a result, the Russians felt compelled to act, felt like they had no choice except to install missiles in Cuba. Of course, the fact that we're, not irradiated and or extinct as a human race means that peace prevailed, but both the Soviets and the United States came extraordinarily close. Kennedy also oversaw the creation of the Peace Corps. And this map indicates in dark blue the countries where the Peace Corps is currently active, and in light blue the countries where the Peace Corps has been active in the past. The idea of the Peace Corps is that young Americans, oftentimes right around college age, will travel to other countries in order to do good things. Those good things, maybe they teach English, maybe they build schools and hospitals, and maybe they irrigate farms, maybe they do medical support if they know how. But with official government support, doing charitable works all over the world, on every continent, and that is not Antarctica. And technically, I guess they don't have any operations in Australia. I guess Australia and New Zealand are doing all right. They don't need Peace Corps help. So the idea certainly is just to alleviate suffering in the world, and that is worthwhile. But it's important to remember that in the context of the Cold War, the United States is trying to persuade as many countries as possible that we're swell, and also prevent those countries from thinking that the Soviet Union is sweller than we are, right? So one comparison that I want to make is that the Peace Corps, in some ways, is a more global version of the Marshall Plan. Right? You remember that at the end of World War II, the United States was like, "Hey, let's throw a bunch of money at Europe and help them rebuild." This is, I mean, the Peace Corps is relatively cheap actually in comparison to how much goodwill it generates in the United States. But we're going to send people rather than money, and we're going to do it all over the world, not just in Europe. And so, very similar motivations of trying to persuade countries to like the United States rather than the Soviet Union. And the Peace Corps, even after the Soviet Union fell, is still active, similarly trying to improve quality of life and at the same time, use soft diplomacy to convince other countries that the United States is a great place. JFK is assassinated in 1963, and at that point, Lyndon Johnson takes over as president, and he starts a program that's referred to as the Great Society. Uh, Historians and the College Board have made direct connections between the New Deal and the Great Society. In both cases, you have the federal government increasing taxes in order to provide services to the American people. In particular, Medicare, government subsidized or potentially fully funded health insurance for old people, is sort of an expansion of Social Security, right? In the beginning, there's no services. Then they get money, then they get health insurance. And then some people have argued that Biden's American Recovery Plan / infrastructure package could potentially be the third wave of this expansion of, yes, increased taxation, but also increased services. LBJ has, as not a specific program, but instead sort of I don't know, a whole suite of programs, what he refers to as the war on poverty. His argument is that the United States in the 1960s is the wealthiest country on earth, and as a result, the government can and should and has a responsibility to address poverty as much as possible. Now, note that in part because of LBJ's mistakes in Vietnam, uh, once he leaves office, a lot of those programs either disappear and or are less funded. So, you may have noticed that right now in 2021, boy, is there poverty. In fact, before COVID, there was still poverty. So it's not like LBJ's plans were successful. Depending on who you ask, the lack of success might be because we didn't commit hard enough to it. Some of it might be because LBJ spent all of his time on the Vietnam War and didn't follow through on his proposals. But clearly, the war on poverty was not victorious because poverty still exists. One example of LBJ's war on poverty is the program Head Start, which some of you may be familiar with because it's possible that you and or family, friends, or neighbors participated in it. The idea is that public schools generally provide kindergarten through 12th, but what if earlier education, for example, preschool, was also universally available? And so the idea of Head Start is that if you give small children before their school age a Head Start, presumably over the course of their lives, you'll have long-term benefits. And generally speaking, that's true. The more education a person gets, especially in the crucial early years, the longer their life-term earnings and criminal record and all the rest are better. One of the things to note in the case of LBJ, you'll notice this sign over here says Mrs. Johnson. This is Lady Bird Johnson, the First Lady. It's starting right around this point when First Ladies have sort of issues that they champion. Right. So in the case, Jill Biden has been championing education. She's been a community college professor for decades. Melania Trump, at least theoretically, was championing anti-cyberbullying efforts. Michelle Obama championed healthy exercise and or diet, especially for kids. So the idea that first ladies have their sort of top priority issue that they advocate for in a lot of ways is traced back continuously, at least, to Mrs. Johnson. In particular, you may remember that Eleanor Roosevelt was really active, but she was sort of a one-off and sort of an exception. The presidents in between, or excuse me, the first ladies in between Eleanor Roosevelt and Lady Bird Johnson didn't really have coherent policy positions. And so Lady Bird Johnson starts this continuation of 60 years or so of first ladies having priority issues that they advocate for. LBJ in 1964 signs into law the Civil Rights Act, which is a landmark law that grants the federal government a whole new array of powers in order to prevent segregation at both public and this is the twist, also potentially also at some private institutions as well. And so here he has doing the signing procedure. Typically when presidents sign things, they'll use a different pen for each letter. So you see he has a bunch of different pens in his hand, and that way the pens are given as gifts to different people. And in this case, he's giving a pen to Martin Luther King Jr., who was one of the key agents in organizing public pressure and agitating to demand that the Civil Rights Act be passed. And so one of the things to note is that in the same way that the Great Society is the second version of the New Deal, the civil rights movement is also described as being the second Reconstruction. Right after the Civil War, there was an end to slavery. There's about 10 years or so where there's major gains in rights for former slaves and free blacks and other people of color. And then that largely goes away. And then it comes back again in the 1960s. After the 1964 Civil Rights Act, Congress then passes the 1965 Voting Rights Act, which you'll note over here, they're still calling to an end to segregated public schools because this is fully 11 years after Brown versus the Board of Education, but schools still haven't desegregated. And in particular, they're demanding voting rights. So with a Voting Rights Act, there's a whole set of restrictions put on states. They're no longer allowed to do literacy tests. They're no longer allowed to have poll taxes. That's actually a constitutional amendment. And there's major gains on the topic of people of color, both men and women, being able to exercise the right to vote. Note from this picture, you'll see that there's a white guy over here. Oftentimes, the role of white activists, kind of participation in the civil rights movement is overlooked. But you'll also note that the sign behind him says jobs for all. So there's a transition right around 1965 from political pressure to now having economic pressure. Because yes, people of color can vote, but they're still consistently discriminated against in employment, in hiring and firing, in job applications. And so that's a shift that is a noteworthy twist between the earlier and late 60s in terms of what the priorities are for the civil rights movement. 1965 also sees Lyndon Johnson signing the Immigration Act. And so this photo, you can see Lyndon Johnson over here. You can see the Statue of Liberty over here. And while he's there at this sort of, I don't know, icon of American immigration, he signs into law, as I mentioned before, 1924's Immigration Act sharply restricts not only the total number of immigrants, but specifically immigrants from sort of undesirable places, i.e. most of the world. And then the 1965 Immigration Act upends that. It eliminates the quota system. It has a more fair and open process by which immigration is possible. So there's not only more immigrants that can come over, it's immigrants from parts of the world that had been completely banned. And in particular, if we think back to immigration from Asia, which was outlawed under the Chinese Exclusion Act from China specifically, and then later the Gentleman's Agreement that restricted it from Japan, the 1965 Immigration Act fundamentally changes who is allowed to come into the country and is part of the reason for the demographic shifts that have happened in the last 56 years. So it's worth noting that all of these examples were fundamental game changers, not only in the role of the United States, but also successes for LBJ personally, right? He was able to get support in part because of personal connections that he had made in Congress to have multiple victories that have made the country what it is today. And yet Lyndon Johnson is frequently remembered not for any of those successes, but instead for the Vietnam War. In 1965, an American ship is fired at the Gulf of Tonkin, which is near Vietnam, and what he says publicly to the American people, in 1964, he admits in 1965 that he's not actually clear what was happening and who was shooting at who. In 1964, the American ship reports that it's been fired upon by the Vietnamese, and as a result, the United States escalates its presence in Vietnam. JFK had sent over a small number of military advisors. You remember that Eisenhower had pledged American support during the 1950s. So it's not like Lyndon Johnson started it from scratch, but as this quote, which was not publicized until decades later, LBJ did not actually have evidence that the Vietnamese had done anything. It was instead a case where he was just like, well, we really want to fight North Vietnam because they're communists and we don't like them. This is an opportunity that we can use to fight a war that we already want. And he sort of exploits that opportunity. You can draw a direct comparison between the Gulf of Tonkin and, depending on which flavor you prefer, either maybe the USS Maine, the American ship that was fired upon outside Cuba that started the Spanish-American War, or maybe you would make a comparison to the war with Mexico and how Polk sent soldiers into harm's way, knowing they'd be fired upon, so that he'd have an excuse for the war. But in any case, Lyndon Johnson gets a lot of the blame for the fiasco that the Vietnam War turns out to be. One of the most well-reported examples, and I do want to warn you because there's a graphic image coming up in a moment, so I'll tell you when it's safe to look if you'd rather not look at it, is the My Lai massacre. There are American soldiers in 1969 who opened fire on Vietnamese civilians, not in the heat of battle, but effectively as mass executions. And there's this photograph and others like it were published in newspapers, not only in the United States, but all over the world, as an indication that the United States not only is there for the wrong reason, i.e. the Gulf of Tonkin, but while they're there, they are a net negative rather than a net positive. And so the idea is that the United States' presence in Vietnam from the get-go arguably was unjust, and that while the United States military was there, it was doing more harm than good, all in the interest of preventing the Vietnamese communists from the north winning and taking over the country. All right, if you looked away, you could look back again. Now this is just a map. 1968 is a key turning point. Note that by this point, the United States had been fully engaged in the war for 4 years, right, from 64 to 68. And Americans kept telling themselves, the government kept telling the people, victory is right around the corner. Next month, the North Vietnamese will surrender. Next month, next week. And in 1968, the North Vietnamese organize a massive counterattack on US forces. The geography here on the map, Vietnam runs along the coast of the peninsula, but then to the west, you have Cambodia and Thailand. And North Vietnamese forces on Tet, the Vietnamese New Year, launch an attack not only on the border between North and South Vietnam, but through Cambodia, launch an attack on the Vietnamese border with Thailand and the Vietnamese border with Cambodia. And so this massive attack, which does not necessarily actually gain a lot of ground necessarily, but demonstrates that victory is not next week or next month, but potentially years away. And so week after week, month after month, year after year, the American people become disillusioned and discouraged and more convinced that the war is not going to end anytime soon, certainly not with an American victory. It is as a consequence of all these factors that when the 1968 Democratic Convention happens in Chicago, it is contentious, to say the least. LBJ announces that he is not going to run for president. There's multiple Democratic candidates, some of whom want to withdraw from the war, some of whom want to continue it, and anti-war and pro-war and middle of the line moderate Democrats have protests that turn violent. There's actually a Netflix film called The Chicago 7, if you want to watch that. Dramatizes part of that conflict. But 1968, it's worth noting, has riots not only all over the country, but all over the world. There's mass demonstrations in Paris and Mexico City, and 68 is sort of the high mark for unrest between people and their governments. But the consequence of the 68 convention, for the United States at least, is that Richard Nixon wins the presidency. He'd actually run for president many times. And one of the hilarities you can see from this pin, I actually have a copy of this pin at school, which I'd show you, but COVID, calls for new leadership, which is hilarious when we realize that Spiro Agnew has to resign for tax fraud and that Richard Nixon is responsible for Watergate, which we'll get to next week. But the idea that they represent new leadership is, I don't know, at the very least, darkly humorous. One of the elements that doesn't become public until decades later is that Richard Nixon sabotaged peace talks in 1968. Right? There were good faith peace talks being made by North and South Vietnam that potentially could have ended the war in '68. But Nixon was afraid that if the war ended while a Democrat was in charge, then not only would Nixon lose the election, but Democrats would win and Republicans would lose future elections because Democrats had ended the war. So Nixon, illegally as a private citizen, sabotages the peace talks and is arguably responsible, maybe for some percentage at least, for all of the death and destruction that happens in the Vietnam War after 1968. Of course, this article isn't published until 2017. So by this point, Richard Nixon is dead for decades, and people don't find out about it until much, much later. But this is a little bit of foreshadowing about the types of backroom shadiness that Richard Nixon is involved in, and boy, is there a whole bunch more after that.